Welcome to the Medical Support to Irregular Warfare podcast, an initiative to discuss and educate the evolution of medical support in peace, security, and conflict in uncommon environments. Points, perspectives, and opinions voiced here are solely those of the contributors and do not represent any formal association or government entity. We do everything possible to ensure the information and discussion is sound, comprehensive, and from the most credible sources.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another MSIW podcast, and we hope that you enjoy the content and quality of the work. Please join us and contribute by notes or email to our effort. The discussion today is on new actors in the operational environment. Irregular warfare, being non-traditional at best, will see unfamiliar actors in play with challenges. These actors could include academics, non-governmental organizations, and others who are and will be more substantial interactions in future competition and conflict. Here today specifically, we would like to discuss nonprofit organizations and medical support. Today, our esteemed guest is Mr. Michael Torconi. He is a longtime friend and colleague of mine, and we will apologize in advance if we get too informal during our talk here. Mike presently and most recently is working as a critical care flight paramedic and a community paramedic in some of the most austere Arctic regions of Canada. Mike has a distinguished military, educational, and author history, and I'm actually very envious of your technically advanced literature for paramedic levels, Mike. Thank you for that from the entire community. Mike, you also have a thorough history in volunteer nonprofit organizations, specifically supporting the Ukraine conflict since the very first month of post-invasion. Welcome to you, sir, and may I trouble you just to give us some opening personal thoughts, especially to your perspective as a veteran that has been in service to nonprofit efforts.
Thank you very much, Mike, for having me on the podcast today, and thanks also to everybody else, the Promfield Care and MSIW podcast and initiative. It's truly a pleasure and an honor being hosted on this amazing platform. I would like to start with a little talk about the definition of irregular warfare, because this wouldn't otherwise be a podcast on IW or a discussion on IW if we didn't spend at least the first 10 minutes arguing about the definition. You know, among the coalition, among NATO, the United States, there are slight difference in the doctrinal definition of irregular warfare, and the same can be said for the strategic competitors with their version or definition of irregular warfare, hybrid warfare, may that what you will. But the one thing that is common to all of these definitions is that, as opposed to regular warfare, where you have the action of a government that is exercised primarily through and towards the military, in irregular warfare, you have the action of the government that is exercised mainly to and through population. So it switches the playing field of the conflict from a purely military arena to a more holistic approach that heavily involves society in its entirety. So, you know, when one asks themselves, why are we talking so much about nonprofit, non-government organizations when it comes to irregular warfare? Where irregular warfare creates the perfect conditions for these new and non-standard actors to emerge and to potentially play significant roles into the evolution of these conflicts in the next few years. You know, when we think about the entirety of the planet, a large part of the world population to this day, unfortunately, depends on the initiative of nonprofit and non-governmental organizations when it comes to access to basic service, clean water, hygiene, medical care. And those are all things that in an irregular conflict, in a irregular warfare scenario, become absolutely potentially instruments for the conduction of that conflict itself. So being aware of this and having these discussions and, you know, asking ourselves as a community, what has changed and where is this going to go in the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years, I think is absolutely vital, because we are going to see less military action and more action from non-military actors. And the ones we've mentioned so far are potentially some of the prime ones that we're going to see stepping into this arena.
I appreciate leading off with a definition of IW, Mike. And I was at a conference, and a significant American commanding general said specifically, our goal in the next 12 months is to make sure we simplify and the force understands an idea and concept of IW. So we obviously have not defined that as a community or as an alliances or in any way very firmly quite yet. I think you'll agree to that.
Absolutely. I love the Dr. Mayer definition in the last episode of the podcast when he said, well, anything that is not regular
Is
warfare.
100%. And
And
just to your point too, in irregular warfare, I think the military as a whole or security forces as a whole or any government effort, whether that be in partnership, will not have the infrastructure that you would expect in a conventional conflict. So therefore, these new actors or emerging actors on the IW war space will be critical in some of those supports.
Absolutely. Towards the ends of GWAT, immature theaters was a big word that we started talking about when prolonged field care as a concept was developed. Well, those immature theaters are the standard. They are going to be the standard for the foreseeable future, and that creates the condition for non-governmental organizations or other entities to potentially fill in some of those gaps.
Yes, sir. Absolutely. So when we were talking a little bit about definitions, Mike, give us some thoughts on humanitarian organizations. Just what does that mean when we talk about humanitarian organizations?
Yeah, humanitarian organizations going back to the definition game, we could have a podcast alone on that definition, but when we talk about international humanitarian organizations, we need to understand what we're talking about, a broad spectrum of entities that as a uniting factor are regulated by international right and international law, following a set of principles, a set of rules that have they can somewhat be traced back to the League of Nations. But when we talk about humanitarian principles, there is four that are key and common, and those are independence, humanity, impartiality, and neutrality. And those, think about those applied in conflict. International organizations, international humanitarian law specifically has another set of principles, and those are the prohibition of unnecessary suffering, especially in regards to civilian population, military necessity of action, and to that follows proportionality, precaution, and then one that I think it's very important that we keep central to the entirety of this discussion, which is distinction. Distinction is a fundamental principle of international humanitarian law, which states that parties within a conflict needs to clearly distinguish between combatants, civilians, military objectives, civilian objectives. When you extend that to our current situation, to regular warfare, you can clearly see how distinction between combatants, civilians, combatants, and NGO personnel, that becomes a very, very actual point of conversation.
Yes, sir. And I think you and I both have similar feelings about this, but a values-based approach with that respect and that distinction in conflict is significant both for security forces and obviously for humanitarians too as well. We're going to throw around a couple of other titles or definitions or subjects. One is non-governmental organizations, which is really just basically an entity that's not part of any of the local or federal government of any nation that we might be in. It might be that nation's aid efforts or humanitarian efforts or nonprofits within the country. Our experience has been in nonprofit organizations and NPOs conduct business for the benefit of the general public. They have no shareholders, and they do it without a profit motive. And one quote I like that I heard from someone that you and I have worked with is our action is our activism. So it's all in good, genuine effort and within humanitarian law. So, Mike, just from your experiences, both military and in the humanitarian nonprofit world, can you give us some thoughts on security efforts and humanitarian theory?
Absolutely. I think we should start by understanding that while we might be now navigating uncharted waters in the age where we live, and we're talking about irregular warfare, we're talking about an ever-changing dynamic scenario, the interaction between non-government nonprofit, humanitarian organization, and security forces is not new. We look back in history. I mentioned earlier the League of Nations, and if we look back in 1863, Battle of Solferino in North Italy, I did my basic training not far from there. Was the first official episode in recorded history in which there was an official understanding agreement between an humanitarian organization, particularly the International Committee for the Red Cross, and at the time, the French Imperial Army. And since then, this interaction between this coexistence in the same space between humanitarian actors and security forces been a constant throughout World War One, World War Two, Korea, Vietnam, all throughout the more recent conflicts. And the early 2000s, with the starts of the campaigns in Iraq and Afghanistan, as Western nations, we went through 10, 15 years of, a established model of interaction between the security forces and these actors. I'm not saying that it was necessarily the right model or the best model or even a good model, but it certainly was a predictable model. And I dare to say that anybody that came out through the military or through the ranks of humanitarian organizations during the use of Iraq and Afghanistan could appreciate the predictability of that model. Big event that has sort of changed the course of history in the way these interactions developed has been the Battle of Mosul. Started in 2016, when all the way throughout 2017, basically. And what happened then? Campaign to liberate Mosul from ISIS. Mosul was entirely occupied by ISIS. That created a massive humanitarian tragedy that involved about 2 million civilians. And obviously, the international humanitarian response mechanism decided to intervene. The problem is that Battle of Mosul, being one of the first new large-scale, major scale combat operations that put against each other almost two symmetric armies, ISIS and the Iraqi forces. It created those conditions in which you basically had frontline locations that were occupied by, or were supposed to be occupied by, humanitarian organizations. And at that time, the traditional actors that felt, for good reasons, that that was potentially against those principles: neutrality, impartiality, humanity, and independence, decided to not intervene because that would have necessarily needed to be protected by Iraqi forces. And so that saw the birth of new humanitarian actors, more grassroots effort of organizations that decided to fill that space and fill that void. And it was the first time, basically, in which it was in our modern recent history, in which it was officially sanctioned by specifically the United Nations at the time, the WHO, that it was okay for a humanitarian organization to be protected by military forces. Ukraine, at the beginning of the large-scale invasion in 2022, we found ourselves again into uncharted waters. The open question from Mosul hadn't been answered yet. Russia was being treated by majority of the world as an absolute evil, and that promoted, some behaviors among some non-governmental organizations, non-profit organizations that could be definitely seen as crossing lines. And I'm talking about NGOs training military formations openly and officially, which is something that does go against those humanitarian principles that we talked about. NGOs doing that wearing camouflage, wearing tactical or tactically adjacent gear, which again, if we go back to that principle of distinction,
Yes, sir.
creates a precedent and creates confusion, potentially legitimizing targeting from the other side, and all kinds of second and third order effects that are not necessarily desirable in that kind of space. And that led to the situation that we have now, where we're in an even more confused situation in which the role, function, and ethics of non-profit actors within conflict areas are very much an open question.
Yes, sir. Agreed. And I appreciate the description. I know you served in Mosul, and we appreciate that example. And just trying to provide the humanitarian perspective a little bit, especially if we have the audience here. That spurred the introduction and assimilation of the World Health Organization's Red Book, which really tried to reset the standards for that community when it came to interaction and in being embedded near military forces or with military forces after that experience in Mosul. And something I would just like, and I didn't attend this workshop, but Brown University a couple of years ago did run a workshop speaking on several subjects: interaction of humanitarians with security forces, veterans serving in non-governmental organizations, and this type of situation. But just to give our security audience a little bit more perspective, but they kind of defined it in big H and little h organizations. And big humanitarians, big H organizations, think of that as Doctors Without Borders. They stick to a rigorous separation. Yeah, they see that relationship with security efforts as black and white and very binary. They intend to remain with those and have control of that. And just as you defined them, Mike, earlier, there is a strong and historical legacy tradition of humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence, to those big H humanitarian operations. They will live and die by those principles for victims of conflict or crisis. Little H organizations are, I think, what you and I have the more experience in, which are more understanding of situations and can be flexible to accomplish the most potential there. You have any thoughts on pros and cons of big and small H organizations, especially interactions with security forces?
Yes, Mike. Well, I think with when it comes to the big H organizations, we are talking about established structures, organizations that are working within an established framework that includes other organizations and controlling entities. And for that matter, they're not necessarily going to be your most adaptive and agile organizations to respond to new scenarios. But at the same time, they're going to be more predictable. And because they're more structured and they have more relationships with those higher order international organizations, they certainly will offer more guarantee to adherence to the humanitarian principles in these times of uncertainty. When it comes to their attitude towards, for example, former military personnel, veterans that are seeking employment in the NGO, NPO world, those big H organizations tend to be a little bit more conservative. For example, some of the ones that you mentioned will require that anybody who has served in the military will have a certain amount of years of separation from service before they can be employed by a big H organization. And that's going back to that principle of distinction. They want to create that black and white separation. Small H organization, they're going to be more agile and they're going to be adapting more rapidly to this new changing and developing environment. So potentially they're going to be more impactful in the short terms in this environment. But they also run the risk of committing irreparable damage because of this unpredictable nature and the lack of oversight. And again, it's very easy when you don't have the full understanding of an immature theater to make mistakes. And if you're operating, with this very agile and adaptive tempo, I think it's much easier to run into those mistakes.
Yes, sir.
When it comes to military personnel, small H organizations are probably going to be the one that are going to be more favorable in potentially recruiting and seeking veteran personnel.
Absolutely. And I didn't intend, the discussion to really go towards veterans in non-governmental organizations, but that will happen. That will occur, as we have seen in the past, and you and I are examples of that. However, I think you brought up a good point there. With small H organizations, you have to have the understanding, especially in security elements and with big H organizations, that these small H organizations, they don't have the infrastructure, the history, the understanding of international humanitarian law and their adherence to that, and just how clear that must be. I would argue it's possible that they could confuse and frustrate the environment just a little bit more without the proper guidance and just making sure that we're clear there. So even though they're genuine and outright and heartfelt in their efforts, just making sure that we are in the right place and time with values-based applications is pretty important here. And I think we've heard, you and I have both heard, and I'm sure a lot of the audience has heard too, maybe some some inappropriate references to the use of NGOs and not really within strict MLE or moral, legal, and ethical guidance and adherence that we should be abiding to.
Yes, there's been a podcast quite recently that it's a veteran run podcast that has a very large follow amongst general population, and another soft veteran was hosted, and this soft veteran went to the extent of saying that NGOs are a new instrument for carrying out deniable military operations, and I think this is it's a good example for potentially veterans that are looking to get into this space, to get into the NGO, NPO world. It's a good example of understanding the amount of responsibility that people from our community carry when they walk into this world. Comes oftentimes people from the soft community, we get automatically considered subject matter expert in security and geopolitics, even though most of us barely have a tactical grasp of things, especially myself. But so the words that we say, especially among the general public, they carry a different weight. So we should be very careful as to what we put out there, because the second and third order effects of that might not be even imaginable at this time, especially in the age of AI and digital surveillance and all that.
Yes, sir. Agreed. And I think we often say, especially with special operations forces, is the most political force in the world. We have gained that trust. We will always have the recognition in public, in media, whether that be black and white. Any loss of that trust will affect us strategically. And again, you spoke of tactical perspective. We also have to have, I don't mean to lecture here, but we have to have that strategic perspective in IW. And in that prior podcast, as you mentioned before, with the Pacific strategist, Andy Mayer, without prompting in that podcast, he recognized humanitarian efforts and medical impact of nonprofits as significant to IW, especially in the competition phase, which we are mostly in right now. So pretty significant perspectives that I think, and I would hope that we would appreciate as a community.
Absolutely, and I'm glad you mentioned that, Mike, because we need to understand that every strategic competitor is doing this, and especially People Republic of China is extremely good at doing this and giving governance and directing those nonprofit to tackle and achieve those geopolitical goals. And I think that looking at geography-wise, if you look at Africa and the work that nonprofits of the strategic competitors have been doing over the last 30 years is an excellent case study for that, and a good reminder that disengagement on our side is potentially dangerous, because disengagement leaves a void, a gap, and that gap will be filled by somebody.
Absolutely.
Like we said, the strategic competition is really good at doing that.
Absolutely. In irregular warfare, looking from the competition phase all the way to proxy wars, each of the competitors are always looking to fill gaps, and they'll do that medically in order to gain influence off a certain area.
Medically is always a low-hanging fruit. Non-lethal aid, soft power. Non-lethal
always
aid
soft
is
power.
Yep.
Yes, sir. We were recommended a podcast here recently by Ms. Andrea Leiner, who's the emergency director there for GRM, and I appreciate it. It was a great podcast, and it was from the new Humanitarian podcast series, and the subject was at the recent UN General Assembly, and it was really asking the question again for their community, the difference between activism and humanitarianism. And I think you and I both listened to that in preparation for this discussion. And it's true of many conflict activists, versus values-based nonprofits as well. And their question was, what's the difference between a humanitarian and an activist? And if please agree or disagree, but we both thought, okay, that's an interesting subject, but maybe not relevant to this discussion. But after a little bit of contemplation, I think there's a case to be made here in translation. They have activists versus humanitarians in their communities and efforts, and we have true professionals, and we also have maybe a conflict activist or a military extender that might occur naturally or unnaturally in our sphere of influence, in our operations. Any thoughts to that?
I think it is absolutely it's a absolutely valid reflection. At the end of the day, if you look at some of the nonprofit organizations that are out there now, and you look at some contracting organizations that have been doing similar services, in the same theaters, uh, 20 years ago, there is a parallel, that you can draw, but the difference between the humanitarians versus the conflict activist is, like you said, it's the legacy, it's the history. Humanitarians organization probably spent a large amount of time, maybe even before the conflict arose, to work, live, breathe the same air that the local people in a certain area have been breathing. They have an understanding and a knowledge of that environment that somebody that just comes in after a conflict starts, for example, your conflict activist is a good example of that. They will lack all of those things. They will lack the understanding of the operational environment, and potentially they could complicate it significantly for everybody. And 2022 in Ukraine again is a good example of that. A multitude of conflict extenders swarmed Ukraine as soon as the large-scale invasion happened. And initially, in the stun, in the chaos of the aftermath of the invasion, everybody was welcome. But then the Ukrainian government quickly realized a few weeks in that that was creating more problems than it was solving. And since this is a medical podcast, right? We look down at the tactical level to that. A lot of former veterans going in and doing medical training. What's the first thing that they want to teach everybody? That's because we love tourniquets, is tourniquets.
Exactly.
Uh, the ICRC has written two really good manuals on war surgery where they don't say tourniquets are bad. They just caution introducing tourniquets in a system that's not designed for it, because they have that history and experience, of hundreds of years of conflicts in all parts of the world. Well, now you're introducing tourniquets in a system that's potentially not ready for it. You're causing an epidemic of preventable limb losses. And again, especially for people from our community, I think that might step into this world. This is a good reminder that there are second and third order effects that we're oblivious to unless we spend that time to understand the environment.
Especially in that uncontrolled IW environment. Yeah. I'd like to just stop here just for a second and say, hey, simplify. Whether humanitarians that might be listening right now, security forces, soft forces, guys that are out there right now, just to make it easy, simplify the situation at all times. And I'm going to go back to Miss Liner. She gave us a quote. There are different flavors of NGOs out there, but if you only play with the military extender, or my words, conflict activist, then you're losing all of the information currency that comes out of the big H sector, which is valuable to security and the future peace, which I think is a fair perspective. And I think it's difficult to argue with that.
I couldn't agree more with that quote, Mike.
A second thing I'd like to do is just give a personal lesson that I learned from my dad. My dad did two 18-month tours in Vietnam, and during those tours, they would get two weeks off at different intervals and go back to Bangkok. And it was so ironic because they put the Special Forces and the American Peace Corps in the exact same hotel. So two completely different views that you would think would not get along were in the same hotel. And my dad told me differently. He was like, no, we had the greatest time together. If you think about it, we had a great deal in common. We all had a sense of duty. We all had a feeling of service to others. We just did our jobs in a little bit different ways, but they always had a great time together, and they got along extremely well. So just a little perspective or history there that might be worthwhile.
I think that is a great example, Mike. And we've said many times that you will find similar people on both sides. That culture of service, that wanting to put yourself out there in potentially dangerous situations for the safety and benefit of others, is certainly a trait that can unite people on the military and the humanitarian side of things.
Yes, sir.
Without a doubt.
In this series, we always would like just to look at difficult questions, not yet answered or solved. And I think one question here is really kind of an open question. At the net sum of all of our discussion today, Mike, can humanitarian principles survive when security and aid become entangled? What are your thoughts to that?
I think that this is very much an open question and very much one that we should keep tackling until we get to the yes answer, because I think that humanitarian principles has to survive for humanity to survive. I just think that we need to find the practical way to do it. And I think having these conversations and having the discussion, not just between the two of us, but extending this to the entire community and the larger arena is essential for us to get to that answer.
Agreed. And it's a difficult question, but one that can be solved, in my opinion. We just have to look at those values-based conflict, those moral, legal, and ethical standards and obligations that we have. So I would try to extend that to everyone. 3 big takeaways.
If I could.
No, please.
No, I just you brought up value-based conflict a couple of times, and there's 2 points that I think we should keep in mind when thinking about that. That I think, unfortunately, as a society, particularly the Western society, coming out of the 20th century, which it's often referred to as the century of the ideologies, big ideas that brought to big clashes all over the world, tragedies all over the planet. As a Western society coming out of the 20th century, we've been shying away from ideas and ideologies, and I think oftentimes value-based conflict are perceived like that by the general population, and so I think there's sort of almost a stigma towards that because we're afraid of going back to that. And the other side of it is that cognitive and narrative warfare are domains within irregular warfare that our strategic competitors are extremely good at, especially when it comes to digital population control, think social media, think all of that. This is being exploited. This is being exploited to create a sense of disillusion and disgruntlement and loss of hope in our society. And of course, if you lose hope in the society you live in, it's going to be very hard to think about paying the price of potentially fighting a war for a value or for somebody else's freedom. And so I think we need to be aware of these things and actively try to fight them, because otherwise, again, we'll be playing the strategic competitors' adversaries game.
Yeah, 100%. I think above our pay grade, there's obviously the required pushback onto that. But I think even in the medical world and medical efforts, we need to realize that our competitors are going to use those opportunities. They're going to use the information age. They're going to use the weaknesses of cyber systems in order to target medical efforts and use those political warfare against us. By pushing back, but by also at the point of injury or at the point of action to establish those moral, legal, and ethical conduct. I think is really that example is what's going to drive it back and set the standard again.
Yes, sir.
Okay, within the series, obviously, too, what we try to do is to give our listeners 3 big takeaways that they can use with good confidence, trust, and validity. Give us one of your takeaways. What would you give to our listeners, Mike?
So I would start with, whatever side of whether you're still in service, you're out of service, you're treading into this world, try to proactively be respectful and in your communication interaction with any NGO, NPO, humanitarian, international organization, understanding that there is a lot that you potentially don't know coming into this space, and so do the due diligence. If you are in situations where you're potentially going to be interacting with one of these actors that might be new to you, ask all the necessary questions, confirm the role, the functions, what are your rules of engagements or rules of interaction versus the environment you're working in. And if in doubt, try to follow the money.
There you
Trying
go.
to understand where a NGO, NPO is getting funding from can tell you a lot of what their mission is and where their ties are. If you're trying to follow the money and you can't find where the money goes, it's probably a good sign that they might be behind the wall for a reason. So exert due diligence, but be respectful at all times when communicating with these entities.
Agreed. From both sides of the coin, obviously exercising that critical thought, pragmatism, but at the same time, be proactive and optimistic. Consider them as partners and not adversaries, and look for that synergy. How can we help you? How can you help us within our mandates and with our ethical requirements? So I think that's great. What I would offer is just ever engaging, as you spoke of before, Mike, ever engaging with unknown or small H organizations. Be very, very conscientious about the difference between humanitarians and those conflict activists or those military extenders. I think that's pretty significant. I think that will be more significant in the future because actors are going to be more subject to influence and more subject to being actively tasked in order to gain influence on the ground. Any other thoughts?
I, you know, with the limited experience that I have in this world, I can say that I have met some of the best people uh, that I've ever met in my life in working in some of these organizations. They're living in the same environment as the people that they're helping. They're putting literally everything on the line, and I think it's very, very important to keep that in mind whenever working into this environment, and you know keep those moral, legal, and ethical boundaries very, very much fresh into your mind, because all it takes is one inconsiderate action to jeopardize the work that these people have been doing for a long time at a very high price.
Yes, sir. A lot of good discussions, a lot of good challenges here, especially in the IW environment. But knowing all this, Mike, and after the discussion of all the subjects, would you, sir, still continue to do nonprofit medical support in humanitarianism?
I would.
Okay.
I would, because like we said over and over, on and off the record, that culture of service is part of us, and it's service to humanity before anything else.
Well said. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mike, great thanks for your participation and your complete contribution today. I just want to remind the audience that references for the podcast will include a couple of very valid and respected works to represent both sides of the security and humanitarian coin. These are meant to be worthwhile, beneficial, and balanced in respect. We've tried to establish the fact that irregular warfare will be one of the most politically charged operating environments in history. Now, because of that information age, the use of social media, and those cyber weaknesses, and as we discussed earlier, all of these will be targeted by our competitors. And we have to work to counter that targeting, and we have to work together in that respect. Again, Mr. Michael Tarconi, thank you so very much for your contribution, your time, and all of your service, sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mike.
Thank you for listening to this MSIW program, and we hope that you will both participate and contribute to the notes or offer thoughts, requests, and suggestions via our email link. The best to you, your work, and the relationships and security this effort strives to impact.